Right. Hello, everyone. So yeah, today I'm going to tell you about anti-surveillance knitting, or hacking with yarn 101. This is a bit of a weird talk because it's not maybe your traditional cybersecurity talk, right? I'm going to be talking about knitting, facial detection algorithms, and how to make a jumper. But first, I'll just talk about who am I and why am I here. So hi, I'm Ottilia Westerlund. I was born in Sweden, but I live in Scotland. I lived there for the past 10 years. When I'm not making weird projects, I'm an application security engineer at GitLab. And yeah, I'm a surprise, general, weird, arty, crafty person. This picture here is me knitting in this very, very small vessel on my way to St. Kilda, which is this like abandoned, uninhabited group of islands in the middle of nowhere outside Scotland. Apparently, I'm the only person who's knitted on this boat, because usually people are busy being seasick. So the skipper and the first mate were like, "We need to take a picture of you, you weirdo." So yeah, that's me. So there's a few things I'm going to try to answer in this talk, because there's a fair bit of sort of required knowledge before we actually delve into what is, how do you make this jumper, right? So first I'm going to talk about what knitting is. It seems like a fair amount of people actually have a good understanding, but for you who have no idea what I'm talking about, we'll go through it. We're then going to talk about it's kind of like a weird side note about how knitting has quite an interesting past. I'm going to talk about facial detection algorithms, because we need to know how they work. I'm going to talk about other work that people have done to avoid surveillance, what hyperface is, how it makes a jumper, and most importantly, whether it actually works or not, right? So, knitting. Knitting. So, knitting is basically the act of using yarn to make fabric using knitting needles. It's not using a hook, that's called crocheting, that's another craft. And you can use either 2 or 5 or 3 needles depending on what you're making. So if you're making like a flat piece, you use 2 usually. And if you're making like a big tube, like a sock, say, or a sleeve, you tend to use multiple. The basic unit when it comes to knitting is called a stitch. And you have 2 types of stitches. You have a knit and a purl. So if you're wearing something knitted on today, you can kind of see, so like a knit kind of looks like a V, whilst a purl is kind of more like a wave shape. And then you can obviously increase and decrease the amount of stitches that you have on your needles. And together with these 4 kind of basic concepts, you can make anything from a tea cozy to a jumper. And you can also make different textures. So you can make cables, you can make sort of ribbing, like you have on your sort of sleeves usually. Yeah, all kinds of things. Knitting patterns. So this is how knitters communicate. This is how we document our projects. This is how basically we describe how to make things. And knitting patterns have a huge overlap with algorithms in general. And I've done talks about this before, and how yarn is basically a programmable material. But yeah, so here you see like a basic knitting pattern. You see it's acronym heavy. So the K stands for a knit, the P stands for a purl. It has 4 loops, so it's repeating over and over again. And you can also get sort of if loops. So say if the jumper is a size medium, do 50 stitches. If it's a large, do 70. So you're kind of like getting used to these components that you're reusing throughout the pattern. So this is what this instruction actually gives you, which is just a sort of nice texture to use. So because knitting patterns are a really good way of kind of containing information and just knitted items in general, there's actually had a past in surveillance. And this is a bit of a side note, but I purely think it's quite interesting because I'm talking about anti-surveillance knitting, but there is a past of surveillance knitting. So patterns and knitted items have been used in the past to transmit information during wartime. So this can be like anything, right? So you could have yarn and you can tie knots into the yarn and then use it. And then when you give it to your spy buddy, they can unravel it and then see where you place the knots. Or you can use the knit and purl, say, and then you can embed information like in Morse code or something. And yeah, you can see, so like during the First and Second World War, like you really, like the people needed knitted items. Like this is a leaflet, a British leaflet, which was showing you how to knit things for the men in the fleet. So traditionally, the women would have been staying at back, and they were like helping out with the war effort by making these items. And quite one interesting fact that which I learned when I was originally doing this talk was about the Belgian resistance movement's use of surveillance knitting. So they would hire women that had windows that overlooked railway yards, and they would ask them to sort of see and look at the comings and goings of the enemy forces. And the way they took notes of this was by basically embedding this information into their knitted items. And then when they went up later, they could say, oh, look here, the nice socks I made for your nephew who's in the trenches, rather than, doing a sketchy little paper. It actually became such an issue that in the UK, it got banned from sending knitting patterns to certain countries. So this is a newspaper clipping from the 9th of January, 1940. So yeah, it basically says that you weren't allowed to send knitting patterns unless they came straight from the makers of the content, and they were never to leave the shop until they were mailed. And the reason why they have made this ban is that the enemy agents used hand-knitted garments to convey via neutral countries vital military and naval intelligence by means of cunningly worked codes knitted into material during the last war. This is not really a problem we have to worry about these days. There's loads of other ways you can get surveilled other than, some wee old lady knitting your comings and goings from her window. Although maybe you should worry about that, that would be kind of weird. We have facial detection and facial recognition. So this is the second thing we need to kind of understand before we delve into the jumper making. So there's lots of ways you can detect a face. And so one of the main ones is neural networks. And that's basically what we use mostly these days. They're fast, but they're really expensive to implement because they require a fair bit of memory. Then we have the Viola-Jones framework, which is quite old. It's from 2001. But it's pretty fast and quite low memory intensive. So it's not so used so much anymore, but it's used in things like, say, the autofocus of a camera. When it draws that little square to say, oh, this is a face, it'll probably use something like the Viola-Jones framework. So that basically renders the image into black and white. It then tries to match its human face properties, like eyes and noses, with something called HAR features, which I'm about to talk about. And yeah, as I said, it's still used. So this is HAR detection. So what we're looking at here, it's basically like a calculation where it's looking for various shades in the face. It's doing a lot of sort of maths in the background, but what it basically boils down to is, so is there a face property here or not? So the first one is looking for the kind of eyes, which in most lighting conditions, there will always be like a shadow underneath the sort of brow bone, and then a bit lighter like on your cheek. And same for a nose, right? It will be dark on one side, light, and then dark. So we know how those work now. What have other people done? So these are some ways that you can avoid facial detection and surveillance. I would say the main one would just be don't go outside and put your phone in the microwave, and you'll be fine. If you have to go outside, then, there's some other things you can look at. So there's other people that made kind of patterns that confuse algorithms, that they've sort of printed or whatever. There's people that have done sort of weird, funky makeup or like really abstract hairdos where they sort of cover your sort of features. But you might get some weird chops if you're, some weird looks if you're going to the shop, right, with like a big triangle on your face. And then there are hoodies that mess with infrared cameras. So they're quite clever because, and I'll show an example in a bit, where they basically transmit infrared LED light. So you can't really see it with the naked eye, but it does pick up on the IR cameras. But this only really works in the dark. Or you can knit a sock and put it over a CCTV camera. I've had loads of questions. So when I've talked about, I did this weird project for anti-surveillance knitting, loads of people were like, oh, you're making socks to put over CCTV. That's amazing. And I was like, no, but maybe I should. So if you know the sort of standard measurement of a CCTV camera, let me know. I'll work on a pattern. You might look a bit sketchy doing it though. So here's some other work that people have done. This is Capable. They did basically knitted streetwear where they would sort of dazzle the AI that was trying to detect who you were into, just basically getting confused. This is the Dazzle Club, which is, it's a non-for-profit British art kind of group. They've done sort of art, like performance art, where they're walking through London with this kind of makeup to make a point of trying to avoid the facial detection and recognition that's increasingly being used, especially by the Met Police in London. But yeah, so this is the original pattern, and this is what I ended up with. So it's quite a simplified version of the original pattern. So at this point, I was getting quite worried whether it was still going to work. So this is me testing it using OpenCV, which is a computer vision kind of tool, using the specified feature flag for it, which is hard cascades, which is what I was talking about earlier. And yeah, looked like it was still working, so I was like, yeah, cool. Let's start knitting it. This is the manic scribbles of someone regretting what they've started, because this was obviously not made to be knitted. And normal knitting patterns, if you're used to them, they tend to have kind of small bits that are repeatable. Usually you can kind of predict what's coming next. This was not the case. I was just aggressively had to, every time I was basically knitting, look and count and see where I was. And if I just relaxed for a second, I made a mistake and had to redo it all. It then came to the sort of actually anatomy of the jumper. So I started out with a big tube. And all a jumper is really is a series of tubes that you then sew together, right? So I made a big tube that I then did a thing called steeking, which is like an old tradition that I use in like Fair Isle knitting and traditional Norwegian knitting and things like that. So it felt like a nice thing to sort of hark back to and use that technique. And then, yeah, repeated the pattern twice, sewed it together, knitted a collar, things that you do. And then the sleeves. So I quite quickly realized there's probably no point in actually doing the real pattern on the sleeves. So I randomly generated it, aka just made it up. Just because there was like, it was never going to actually trigger, I think, on the arms, because your arms are not really like large and flat enough. So this is me after some months of toil. So you can see this is before I got some sleeves. This is the insides of the jumper. So something that you might not think about if you're not a knitter is that even though there's not that much black in this, you still have to carry the black with you. So this is what the insides become like. You also have to sort of twist and weave the yarn in so you don't basically strangle yourself when you put it on. But yeah, so this is the gory insides. It's like cable management, you know. So I've done all this work. It's like a year in. I'm really questioning why I even started this. And it came to the day it was finished and I was going to try it. This is me. So here I'm filming a video and I'm then running the video through a thing called VR frame using the hard cascade feature. And as you can see, there's loads of false positives on my body where the algorithm thinks that I'm covered in faces. There are some like false positives, so you can see my ear for a second, it thinks it's a face. But overall, like I'm overloading the algorithm with a bunch of false positives, basically. So here you can see where it thinks there's a face. So obviously if I wear a face mask, it doesn't recognize me as a face. However, it does still think that there are real faces in the image, which is pretty interesting. So yeah, it did work. Kind of. There's a few points to this, right? It works on the intended algorithms, which is, I tested it on the OpenCV hard cascade and VFrame hard detect. These are not like massively used anymore. As I was mentioning earlier, these days you tend to use sort of neural networks. And yeah, it's deprecated in OpenCV, for instance, but you can still sort of trick certain algorithms. It's also obviously not like going to make you not being detected, but what it does do is that it basically like adds loads of fake data to the system. This is a terrifying picture. So I became kind of obsessed with testing the jumper in like various like face apps, because I thought they're probably going to use probably not neural networks if it's kind of doing things locally. So here I thought my little fat, sad face needed a nice classical smile. This is actually nightmare material. And you might wonder, why am I not wearing this jumper, other than the fact that it's not very nice looking. So yeah, once I finished, I did a talk at EMF, which is a hacker maker festival in England. After that, I ended up getting featured in some places, including a Swiss newspaper. But it's currently exhibited for an anti-surveillance fashion show in Kornhaus Forum in Bern, Switzerland. So yeah, that's a picture from the exhibition there. So this is my jumper. It's living its best life without me. So yeah, it's here in situ. And this is, yeah, it, together with some of the other, like, really cool work. And I actually didn't know, so that's the same Italian company I was talking about earlier. And they were actually in that exhibition as well, which I thought was pretty cool. Because that's like a real company, and this is like me being weird during lockdown. So it worked. So yeah, conclusions. I made this so no one else has to. Like, I took one for the team, for like the weird nerd team. The pattern is online. I've sort of open sourced it. So if you, for some reason, want to knit it, you can. It's on Ravelry. As I said, this is not going to actually, let you completely, go black and like avoid surveillance, because nothing is. But it was more of like a fun project to see whether I could actually hack something using Yarn. And I could. Yeah, I'd just like to thank WICCON for doing this lovely conference and for letting me trick all of you to coming to a Nickton talk.
Thank you, Ottilia. We have like 2 minutes left. Do we see any questions for Ottilia? Yes.
Does that not just create a unique signature of the cure? Like working around the cure?
Well, because anyone can make a jumper, right? So, sorry. I mean, yeah, first of all, you're going to be the weirdo wearing a jumper that looks like an ASOS bag. But yeah, I mean, it's the only thing idea is that, like, because say that if loads of people had them, and the the Met Police or something were doing a facial recognition sort of trial, they would get a lot of like fake data into their facial detection set. So that's really the point of it. Well, that's not really the point of it, but that's the sort of idea of it, really. Any other questions? Sorry? Well, not quite. If we're getting to knitting technology, but an Iceland jumper you would start it at the top and you would do kind of round from that way. I did it kind of like bottom to top just to make my life easier. So yeah, that's. So I don't really know what this would be. Maybe Norwegian. I don't know. I don't know what this. Oh, I don't know that, but maybe. Any other questions? I don't know if we have time. At the back. I think the sad reality is I don't think any anti-surveillance clothes actually work. So, like, no, not really. I think if you really want to avoid surveillance, you would wear like a balaclava, and people wouldn't recognize your face. So, yeah, no, not really.